I live in a small house on the edge of Palmerston North, where the wind comes down off the Tararuas most evenings and rattles the kitchen window in its frame. I've never bothered fixing it. My wife, Dorothy, used to say it was my way of keeping the outside world close. She passed 4 years ago, and now I suppose the rattling is just company. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years as a building inspector for the Manawatu District Council. Retired with a decent watch and a bad knee, and I've spent most of the time since then tending my vegetable garden and trying not to become one of those men who talks too much about the past. But some things need saying. Some things sit in your chest for long enough that you either speak them or they harden into something you can't shift. This is about my younger brother Vincent, and about the night I drove 4 hours through a Hawke's Bay storm to pick him up from a car park outside a petrol station with nothing but a duffel bag and my 8-year-old nephew asleep in the back seat of a borrowed car. I need to start a little before that night, though, because nothing makes sense without the years that came first. Vincent is 7 years younger than me. When we were boys growing up in Fielding, I was already in secondary school by the time he started primary. Our parents, Hugh and Rosemary Alderton, were decent people, practical, not unkind, but not what you'd call emotionally generous either. Dad worked at the freezing works. Mom did part-time bookkeeping for a couple of local businesses. They were the sort of parents who showed love through keeping the power on and the fridge stocked, not through saying much of anything. Vincent was different from me in almost every way. Where I was methodical, slow to decide, happy with routine, he was restless and bright, and always talking. He had a gift for people. He could walk into a room full of strangers and come out with 3 new friends and a dinner invitation. People just liked him. Still do, I think, the ones who stuck around. He married young 24 to a woman named Lorraine, who he'd met at a conference in Wellington. She was sharp and ambitious and beautiful, and I liked her well enough at the wedding, though I remember thinking they moved too fast. They settled in Napier, where Lorraine's family had connections, and where Vincent found work doing sales for a building materials company. Within a few years, he was doing well. They had a son, Cameron, born when Vincent was 27, then a daughter, Paige, 2 years later. From the outside, it looked like a good life. From the inside, apparently, it was something else entirely. I didn't know the details until much later. Vincent isn't a man who asks for help. That's the one trait we actually share. He managed things quietly, and when he couldn't manage anymore, he managed the appearance of managing. What I knew, from the occasional phone call and the Christmas visits that happened less and less frequently, was that something had gone tight between him and Lorraine. The laughter had gone out of his voice in a way I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Our parents knew less than I did, or chose to. Mum rang me sometimes and asked if I'd spoken to Vincent lately, in the tone she used when she didn't really want the answer. Then, in the autumn of 2019, Lorraine left him. She didn't leave for another man, as far as I know. She left because she said she had spent 12 years building a life she didn't actually want, and she needed to find out who she was without all of it. Those were the words Vincent told me she used. He said it quietly, sitting at my kitchen table, with his hands flat on the wood, like he was steadying himself against something. He'd driven up to Palmerston North the weekend after she moved out, and that was the most he said about it. What he didn't tell me that weekend, and what I found out slowly in the months that followed, was how badly their finances had unraveled. Lorraine had been managing most of their accounts. When she left, Vincent discovered the house had a second mortgage he'd half known about and entirely misunderstood, that several credit cards were maxed, and that the savings account he thought held a comfortable buffer held almost nothing. He wasn't deceived exactly. He'd been willing not to look, and that's its own kind of problem. He lost the house within 8 months of Lorraine leaving. She'd taken an apartment in Auckland. The settlement gave her a fair share of very little. Cameron stayed with Vincent initially. He was 11 by then. Old enough to have opinions, and Paige, who was 9, went with her mother to Auckland. Vincent rented a small place in Taradale, kept his job, kept picking Cameron up from school. He was holding on, which is what he does. He's good at holding on. But holding on is not the same as being held. Our parents' response to all of this was the thing that I still find hardest to account for. Dad had a phrase he used when things went wrong in other people's lives. They've made their bed. He said it without cruelty, I think, but also without much thought. When Vincent's marriage ended, that was what Mum and Dad concluded, that he'd made choices, and the consequences were his to carry. Dad said to me on the phone, a month after Vincent told us about the house, "He'll work it out. He's not a boy." If he'd listened to me about the finances years ago, none of this would have happened. That was the sum total of their assistance. They didn't call Vincent more than usual. They didn't offer to help with Cameron. They didn't drive to Napier. They were, I suppose, embarrassed. Divorce was not something that had happened in our family before. They were from a generation and a class of people where you considered that a private failure, and you didn't make it into a problem for others. I thought it was wrong, but I said nothing at the time. I'm not proud of that. Then came the night of the 14th of July, 2021. I remember the date because it was a Thursday and I just finished a final inspection on a development out near Ashurst and come home tired and ready for nothing more than soup and the news. My phone rang at 8:30. It was a Napier number I didn't recognize. It was Cameron. He was 8, I've already said 11, but I need to correct myself. Because I've gone over this so many times, I sometimes scramble the details. He was 11 that year, 11 years old, using a neighbor's phone, calling me from the car park of a Gull station on the outskirts of Hastings. His voice was very steady, steadier than it should have been. "Uncle," he said, and I knew immediately. "Dad's not very well. Can you come?" I asked him where his father was. He said, "In the car." I asked what he meant by not very well. He said, "He hasn't been out of the car for a long time. He keeps saying he's fine, but he won't drive." I asked if they were safe. He said yes. I asked if anyone else knew. He said no. He tried ringing Grandma, but no one answered. I told him to stay on the line. I rang my neighbor from the house phone, got him to come sit with my house, grabbed my coat and my keys, and started driving south. I have a Holden Ute that's getting on in years, and I pushed it harder that night than I probably should have on the desert road in the dark. The wind came in sideways across the plateau, and I drove into it with both hands white on the wheel. It took me just over 4 hours. I found the Gull station. Vincent was in the driver's seat of his old Corolla with the engine off. Cameron was in the back with a jacket pulled over him, pretending to sleep, which I suspect he hadn't done at all. I tapped on Vincent's window, and he looked at me with an expression I've never forgotten. It wasn't shock. It wasn't relief. It was just exhaustion. So deep it had gone past the point where it looks like anything in particular. I opened his door. I said, "Shift over, mate." He shifted over. I drove them to a motel in Taradale, paid for 2 nights on my credit card, and got Cameron into a bed. Then I sat with Vincent at the small table by the window while the rain came down, and he told me everything. The job had gone 2 months earlier. The company downsizing, nothing he'd done wrong. Genuinely. Though he'd spent the 2 months since convincing himself otherwise. He'd been managing fine at first, then not fine, then not managing at all. He hadn't told anyone because he didn't know how to begin. He'd driven Cameron to his football practice that afternoon, and then simply couldn't drive home. He'd sat in that car park for 6 hours. He hadn't eaten. Cameron had bought them both pies from the servo with the last of his birthday money. I sat there and I listened. I didn't say much. I'm not built for the right words in those moments. But I put my hand on his arm at some point and left it there, and I think that was enough for that night. The next morning I rang my manager, arranged a week's leave, and we sorted through the practicalities. Vincent's rent was 3 weeks in arrears. His car registration had lapsed. He had a job interview lined up for the following week that he'd been too low to prepare for. We dealt with it piece by piece. The way you deal with a room full of broken things, not all at once. Just whatever's in front of you. What I didn't expect was my parents' reaction when I called to tell them. Not that I expected warmth exactly, but I suppose I expected some version of concern. What I got instead from my father was a long silence followed by, "Well, you didn't have to drive down there." He would have sorted himself out. My mother, to her credit, asked if Cameron was all right. When I said he was, she said good, and moved on to asking about my knee. I said, on that phone call, something I'd never said to either of them in 60-odd years. "I think you've let him down." There was another silence. Then Dad said, "That's between us and your brother." And the conversation ended shortly after. I brought Vincent and Cameron back to Palmerston North with me. I have a second bedroom. It's small, more of a study, but it has a fold-out, and Cameron slept there while Vincent took the couch for the first few weeks until I borrowed a proper bed from a colleague. My own life adjusted around them the way water adjusts around something dropped into it. My routines changed. The shopping doubled. I learned that Cameron liked Wheat Bix with no milk, and that Vincent drank his coffee too strong and left the plunger on the bench without pressing it down, which drove me slightly mad. I learnt that my nephew had a habit of sitting at the kitchen table in the morning, doing nothing in particular except looking out at the garden, and that it was best to just let him do that without talking. There were harder things to learn. Vincent's mental state didn't recover quickly. He saw a GP, who referred him to a counselor through the DHB, and there was a wait, and then the sessions were too far apart, and some weeks he was fine, and some weeks he was very much not. I'm not a naturally patient person. I'm better with processes and systems than I am with unpredictability, and living with someone whose emotions ran on a different schedule than their visible state was difficult for me. I said the wrong thing sometimes. I pushed when I should have waited. There were 2 or 3 evenings where we were genuinely short with each other in ways that didn't get properly resolved until the next morning. But I didn't ask them to leave. It never seriously occurred to me. The thing that tested that most was not my brother, but a woman I'd been seeing not seriously. We'd only been out perhaps 5 or 6 times, but there was something there I'd been quietly hopeful about. Her name was Judith, a retired nurse from Fielding, who I'd met through a mutual acquaintance at a quiz night. She came for dinner once while Vincent and Cameron were there, and she was pleasant enough on the evening, but she rang me 2 days later and said she wasn't sure our situations were compatible. She said she'd been hoping for something quieter at this point in her life. She wasn't unkind about it, but she was clear. I told Vincent about it later. He looked at me for a long moment and then said he was sorry. I said, "Don't be." And I meant it. Mostly. There's a version of this story where I resented him for that. I want to be honest about the fact that I sat with that feeling for a few days. And it was real. And I had to decide what to do with it. I decided to put it down. Not because I'm saintly, I'm not, but because I looked at my nephew doing his homework at my kitchen table, and I understood that some things matter more than other things, and that's really all. Cameron settled into a school here without too much difficulty. Kids adapt in ways that make you feel both admiration and something close to grief. He was quiet for months, then gradually not. He made 1 friend, then 2. He started talking about football again. He started making bad jokes at dinner, which I took as a very good sign. Lorraine rang occasionally from Auckland. I answered once, when Vincent was out, and she asked after Cameron in a tone that held a complicated mixture of guilt and distance. I told her he was well. I didn't say much more. Whatever had happened between her and Vincent wasn't mine to adjudicate, and I didn't try. My parents came to Palmerston North once during those months. Not specifically to see Vincent, they were passing through on their way to visit my mother's sister in Leven. They stopped for lunch. My mother brought a date loaf, which is her default gesture of reconciliation. My father and Vincent sat in the living room while I made sandwiches, and I could hear from the kitchen that the conversation was halting and careful, full of gaps. After they left, Vincent came into the kitchen and said, "He didn't ask me a single question about how I'm doing." I said, "No." He said, "That's just how he is." I said, "I know." We left it at that. There's a particular acceptance that comes with getting older, not of being hurt less, but of understanding that some people simply cannot give what they haven't got. My father is not a man who knows how to reach towards someone in pain. He never has been. I'm not sure whether that's a character flaw or a wound of his own that never healed. And by now, it probably doesn't matter. 11 months after the night at the Gull station, Vincent got a job. It was with a hardware wholesaler in Palmerston North, not as senior a position as he'd had before, not the money he'd been on, but steady work with decent people and the kind of routine that was, his counselor said, probably the best thing for him. He started in late June of 2022. I remember him coming home that first Friday and sitting down at the table with the expression of a man who has walked a long way and finally found a chair. He got a flat in Awapuni the following month. Not far, perhaps 12 minutes by car. He took Cameron with him, and Cameron took his Weet-Bix and his bad jokes, and my house became quiet again in a way that was both a relief and unexpectedly hard. I stood in the second bedroom on a Saturday afternoon after they'd moved out and just stood there for a while, not doing anything. I'm 63. I've lived alone for 4 years. I know how to be alone. But there is a difference between solitude you've chosen and the specific absence of people who were just there. And that afternoon I felt it. 18 months on from that, Vincent is doing something I didn't expect and probably should have. He's been writing. Not for publication, not yet, anyway. He started keeping a journal during his counseling, and somewhere in there, it became something longer, more shaped. He's been documenting what happened to him. The financial collapse, the depression, the night in the car park, the slow reconstruction that followed. He showed me 12 pages of it on a Sunday afternoon in March, sitting at his kitchen table with Cameron at football practice. He'd printed it out, which I found touching in a way I couldn't quite explain. It was good. More than good. It was honest in a way that was uncomfortable to read, and important for exactly that reason. I told him so. He said he thought maybe it could help other men who'd been where he was. Men who'd sat in cars in car parks because they simply didn't know what to do next. Men who hadn't told anyone because they didn't know how to begin. I said I thought he was probably right. He's got 40 pages now. Last I heard. I want to say something about my parents, because I don't want to leave them as villains in this, and I don't think they are. My father rang Vincent last spring out of the blue, a Sunday evening, which is not something he does. Vincent told me about it after. Dad asked how the job was going, asked after Cameron, and then said something he has never, in my 63 years, said to me or as far as I know to anyone. I think we could have done more for you. Your mother and I. That was all. It wasn't an apology exactly. Not in the full sense, but from my father it was as close as he'll ever get. And Vincent said he found himself unable to say anything for a moment. And then he said, "It's all right, Dad." And he meant it. I don't know what shifted in my father to make that phone call happen. Age. Maybe. His own health has not been great this past year. Perhaps you reach a point where the things left unsaid become heavier than the habit of not saying them. I hope so. I hope there's that reckoning available to all of us, eventually. Cameron is 13 now, and thoroughly himself in the way 13-year-olds are loud and quiet in alternating waves, passionately interested in things that seem to change monthly. Last time I saw him, he wanted to talk about deep-sea fish. The time before that, it was Formula One. I have no idea what it will be next time, but I'll listen to whatever it is because he is worth listening to. Paige, his younger sister, visited from Auckland in January. and stayed 3 nights with Vincent. I had them all for a Sunday roast. She's 12, thoughtful, with her father's eyes and her mother's precision. She helped me with the dishes after and told me, very seriously, that she thought it was good that her dad had someone to help him. I said I thought so too. I think about Judith sometimes, the retired nurse. I wonder if I made peace with that decision too easily, or whether it was genuinely right. I don't know. What I know is that I would make the same choice again, and that seems like enough of an answer. There's something I want to say directly, because I think it bears saying plainly. I have been around long enough to watch what happens to men of my generation when things fall apart. I've seen colleagues take early retirement and then disappear into themselves over the following years. I've seen neighbors lose partners and never recover socially, never ask for help, never let anyone in. I've watched men I respected sit in their dysfunction for decades because vulnerability felt to them like something you don't do. Not publicly, not even privately, not really. My brother sat in a car park for 6 hours rather than ring me. He had my number. He has always had my number. The call eventually came from my 11-year-old nephew, who had the wisdom and the courage that the grown men around him had misplaced. That's not a small thing. That's not something I can smooth over with sentiment. If you're in something right now, if you're sitting in the car park equivalent of wherever you are, managing the appearance of managing, holding on because that's what you know how to do, please ring someone. Not tomorrow. Ring them now. Or as close to now as you can manage. It does not have to be dramatic. It does not have to be a speech. My brother said he wasn't very well. My nephew said his dad needed help. Those are enough words. Those words were everything. Asking for help is not what breaks a man down. Refusing it is. I've also thought a great deal, since all of this, about what it means to stand by your family when it costs you something real. Judith was not a trivial thing. My routines, my sleep, my quiet, none of that was trivial. There were real costs to those 11 months. And I don't think you honor the experience by pretending otherwise. But I will tell you this. I am 60, 3 years old, and I have very few moments in my life that I return to and think, yes, that was right. That was the thing I was here to do. Most of life is not like that. Most of life is maintenance and muddle and the ordinary satisfactions of a day reasonably spent. The night I drove south in the dark, in the rain, with the wind coming off the plateau, that was one of those moments. I have it clearly. I will have it until I don't have anything. My brother is writing about the men who sit in car parks. I am writing this. I don't need recognition for any of it. I need Cameron to be all right. And he seems to be. I need Vincent to keep writing. And he is. I need my kitchen window to keep rattling in the evenings, so I have something to not fix. That's about the size of what I need. If this reaches anyone who is doing what my father did, staying distant because the mess of someone else's life is inconvenient or embarrassing or simply more than you know how to enter, I would ask you to consider the phone call my father finally made. Consider that it landed. Consider that my brother said it's all right and meant it. Consider that it is not too late until it is, and you will not always know when that line has been crossed. And if this reaches anyone who is Vincent, sitting somewhere quiet with the engine off, I want you to know, the person you need to call will come. They will drive through the dark and the rain, and they will tap on your window and say, "Shift over, mate." Let them. I've been turning this over for a long time now, trying to work out what it all means. Not in a grand way. I'm not a man who reaches for grand conclusions easily. But when you've lived through something that cost you real things and gave you real things in return, you owe it to yourself to sit with it honestly. What I keep coming back to is this. The way we treat people in their worst moments is not a small thing. It does not pass unnoticed. It does not leave no trace. My parents chose distance when Vincent needed presence. And that choice rippled forward in ways they couldn't predict. and couldn't control. It took years before my father found the words to acknowledge it. And by then, the damage had already shaped Cameron's childhood, shaped Vincent's recovery, shaped all of it. That is not a punishment handed down from somewhere outside. It is simply the natural consequence of what we do and what we fail to do. Actions accumulate. Silences accumulate. The life you end up with is, in large part, the sum of those accumulations. I think about Cameron a great deal when I think about this. He was 11 years old, and he made the call that his father couldn't make. He had no framework for what he was managing. He just knew his dad needed help, and that his uncle had a phone number. There is a kind of intelligence in that which has nothing to do with school or credentials or experience. It is the intelligence of paying attention to the people around you, of refusing to pretend that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. I don't know where he learned that. I hope some of it came from watching the adults in his life eventually do the right thing, even when it was late. Vincent is writing his story now, 40 pages and counting, for the men who have sat in car parks with the engine off. I think that is the most useful thing he could possibly do with what happened to him. Not performing recovery, actually transmitting it, saying, I was here, and it was this bad, and here is what helped, and you are not the only one. That takes a particular kind of courage that I don't think gets named often enough. It is not dramatic courage. It is the quiet, deliberate courage of being honest about your own collapse so that someone else doesn't have to collapse alone. I did not drive south that night because I am a good person. I want to be clear about that. I drove because my nephew rang me and I couldn't not go. But I think that is actually how most decent things happen, not from some elevated moral position, but from a specific moment where the right thing is so plainly in front of you that stepping away from it would require more effort than doing it. The difficulty is staying awake enough to recognize those moments when they come. What I would say to anyone sitting with a version of what I've described, whether you're the one struggling or the one being asked to show up, is that integrity is not a destination. It is a series of choices, some of them inconvenient, some of them genuinely costly, made over and over across the length of a life. You will not always get it right. I didn't always get it right with Vincent, but you keep making the choices, and you stay honest about the ones you got wrong, and you try again. That is, as far as I can tell, what a decent life actually looks like from the inside.